Hey everyone, welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into Nike's 2026 macro environment. And let me tell you, it's absolutely fascinating to see how external forces are basically rewriting their entire corporate strategy. You know, if you really want to understand business strategy, sometimes you have to look outside the industry itself. Right now, in mid-2026, Nike is essentially a textbook case of a company whose entire playbook is being dictated by forces entirely out of its control. So we're going to look at the harsh realities facing the footwear giant right now, and we'll do it using a specialized analytical framework. All right, let's just jump right in and dispel a really popular myth. Because if you just skim the headlines, you'd probably think Nike's biggest issue is simply its competitors, right? It's that familiar narrative that On and Hoka are eating into its running share, or that Adidas is having this massive resurgence. People think it's all just about cooled brand heat, which, to be fair, is exactly the issue CEO Elliott Hill was brought in to fix. But actually, the real threat is far more systemic. The real problem rewriting Nike's strategy isn't another shoe company at all. It's U.S. trade policy. And you know what that trade policy brings with it? A staggering $1.5 billion price tag. The single largest line item moving Nike's fiscal 2026 plan is this massive tax bill. And what's genuinely concerning for Nike's management here is that this isn't some settled final number. It's an escalating tariff estimate. Just back in June of 2025, they were forecasting a $1 billion hit. By the fall, that estimate jumped up by 50% to roughly $1.5 billion gross. This is a moving, escalating risk that is essentially throwing a massive wrench into every financial projection the company makes. So here's how we're going to unpack this whole thing today. We'll start with that $1.5 billion squeeze, then look at an unbalanced PESTEL framework, touch on economics and sneaker culture, go through the operational ripple effects, and finally break down the four-rung tariff cascade. Okay, part one. Let's look at that $1.5 billion squeeze. So to really get this, we need to look at Nike's starting position. Fiscal 2025 closed out with some pretty bruising numbers. Revenue was down about 10%, dropping from $51.4 billion to roughly $46.3 billion. Imagine taking a pay cut at work only to find out your daily commute costs just literally doubled. That's kind of Nike's baseline right now. The real squeeze, though, comes from their geographical footprint. A staggering 95% of Nike footwear is made in Vietnam, China, and Cambodia. And those are all tariff-impacted zones. Because they manufacture there, taxing imports from those primary hubs effectively becomes a massive tax on Nike's cost of goods. The immediate financial result of all this, gross margins are facing an estimated 1.2 percentage point drag. In a year where you're already trying to rebuild from a 10% revenue decline, losing 1.2 points of margin is just incredibly painful. Moving on to part two, let's talk about this unbalanced PESTEL framework. Now, you've probably heard of the five forces model, right? But that mostly analyzes an industry. We need to look wider, which is exactly why we're using PESTEL. This framework scans the macro environment across 6 categories: political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. Normally, when you run this on a healthy company, the framework gives you 6 relatively balanced cells. But in Nike's case for 2026, the grid is entirely broken. Run cleanly on Nike, PESTEL does something useful, but honestly a little uncomfortable. It refuses to balance. One single force completely dwarfs all the others, and almost everything else on this grid is entirely downstream of it. And that defining force? It's political. As a neutral macroeconomic fact, the Trump administration's tariff regime is the defining external reality of Nike's fiscal 2026. Literally, this is the force that wrote their financial plan. Now, the obvious mitigation strategy would be just to pack up and leave China, right? But the structural problem is that the alternative locations are also tariffed. Vietnam, which is actually Nike's single largest sourcing country, sits squarely inside the exact same trade policy. Nike's current play is to cut China's share of U.S. footwear imports from about 16% toward the high single digits by the end of fiscal 2026. But understand this, that's merely a concentration play. It is absolutely not an exit from the tariff regime itself. Which brings us to part 3, economics and sneaker culture. So here's the central economic bet Nike is making this year. To fight off that 1.2-point margin compression we just talked about, management has actually begun phasing in surgical U.S. price increases starting in the fall of 2025. But that raises a massive, absolutely crucial question. Can Nike raise prices enough to offset those tariff costs without triggering a volume loss that just deepens their revenue hole? Think about it. If your favorite pair of Air Force Ones suddenly costs $20 more, do you still buy them? Or do you walk across the aisle to Hoka or On?
We're looking at a really soft consumer discretionary environment right now. Shoppers are being super careful with their money. And with brands offering highly credible, premium alternatives, the elasticity question regarding Nike's surgical price increases is genuinely wide open. If they push prices too high, consumers might just walk away. And this perfectly illustrates the social element of our framework, which features two opposing currents right now. Over on the left, we've got a massive social tailwind. Athleisure and sneaker culture remains structurally huge, and Nike still owns more cultural mindshare than literally any competitor out there. They are still the undisputed king of mindshare. But on the right, there's a serious social headwind. The brand cooled measurably during their direct-to-consumer, or DTC, overreach years. They pulled out of physical retail stores and ended up ceding shelf space and cultural relevance to On, Hoka, and New Balance. Social is the one force Nike most directly controls, and fixing this gap is exactly what Elliott Hill's turnaround is targeting. He's trying to rebuild those crucial wholesale relationships and double down on sport-led storytelling to reclaim their cultural dominance.
All right, part 4. Let's look at the operational ripple effects. So looking at the technological piece of the puzzle here. While Nike obviously isn't a tech moat company like Apple or Google, technology is quietly the only genuinely helpful force they have right now. They are heavily relying on AI-driven demand planning and inventory allocation. Why? Well, because moving production back and forth across Vietnam, Indonesia, and other Southeast Asian sites without overstocking or running out of product is a massive forecasting headache. Better forecasting is basically the difference between a clean supply transition and a margin-eating disaster. On top of that, they're leveraging first-party data from the SNKR's app and their membership programs to manage these transitions and support those surgical price increases we talked about. They're using the tech to ensure they aren't just flying blind. But meanwhile, the environmental and legal forces, they're turning into major cost centers. Environmentally, Nike's move to zero sustainability commitments run right through that exact same Southeast Asian contract manufacturing base. Investing in sustainable materials adds major costs in a year where every single penny matters. And legally, it's a two-front battle. First, there's intense supply chain labor scrutiny in Vietnam and Cambodia. Auditing and disclosure are vital because the reputational cost of any lapse is just too huge. Second, and this is newly critical, navigating changing customs classifications and shifting tariff schedules by country and product turns trade compliance into a very complex, very expensive operational risk center for them.
Finally, part 5, the four-rung tariff cascade. You see, when a massive political cost like this lands, it doesn't just sit there quietly on a balance sheet. It gets absorbed down a ladder. This is the four-rung mitigation ladder Nike is sequentially building to fight off margin compression, and it maps perfectly to their own stated mitigation strategy. Rung 1 is supply-based geography, so cutting China and spreading across Vietnam and Indonesia. Rung 2 dips into supplier and retail partner margin, which means renegotiating factory and wholesale terms. Rung 3 hits the consumer directly through those surgical U.S. price increases. And finally, Rung 4 targets their own internal cost structure, which usually means making painful corporate cost reductions. But here's the absolutely crucial point. It's all about how far down this ladder a company is forced to climb. A lightly exposed brand gets hit, pulls Rung 1, and stops. A moderately exposed brand might have to reach down to Rung 2. But Nike is forced to pull all four rungs simultaneously. That is the real reality check of the $1.5 billion figure. The shock is so unimaginably large that no single lever can absorb it. The response cannot be careful and sequential. It has to be everything, everywhere, all at once. And honestly, that brings us to a pretty profound diagnostic. When a company has to reach all the way down to Rung 4 and pull absolutely every absorption lever at the exact same time, it delivers a harsh verdict on their strategic position. They're acting as a company whose macro environment has quite literally outrun its toolkit. The political force was large enough to reorganize the entire fiscal year from the top down, and all the other PESTEL forces are just playing supporting roles in the fallout. Which leaves us with the ultimate strategic question for 2026. The real issue isn't whether Nike's brand is recovering under Elliott Hill. The brand and the sneaker culture are definitely still there. But because Nike's entire low-cost footwear supply base sits trapped inside a tariffed zone, we have to ask, can any brand, even one as globally dominant as Nike, truly out-execute a macro shock of this magnitude that it cannot physically exit? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep an eye on those upcoming quarterly earnings, guys, because how Nike navigates this cascade is going to be a masterclass in modern macroeconomics.